My name is Shelby Carter. I am 29 years old. And last Christmas, I came home early from a business trip to surprise my fiancé Evan. I carried a gift wrapped in gold ribbon, dreaming of our first holiday together. But when I opened the door, the warmth of the lights and the scent of pine needles hid a truth that shattered everything. My younger sister Emily was on his lap by the fireplace, kissing him like I had never existed. From that moment, nothing about family, loyalty, or love would ever mean the same again. And by the end of this story, you will see how the choices I made that night turned betrayal into a reckoning. Neither of them will ever forget. That night changed everything. But to understand how it all began, let me take you back to the moment I thought Christmas would be the happiest day of my life. I had been counting down the days until Christmas, imagining the look on Evan's face when I surprised him at home. My business trip in Denver ended a day earlier than planned, and I booked the first flight back to Chicago. I pictured us sitting by the tree he promised to decorate, sipping wine and laughing about how this would be our first Christmas together in our own home. I carried a carefully wrapped box tied with a gold ribbon, something I had chosen weeks before just for this night. The cab dropped me off in front of the townhouse on West Belmont Avenue. The air was sharp with December cold, and lights from neighboring houses glittered against the snow that lined the sidewalks. My heart raced as I climbed the steps to our porch, gift in hand, cheeks pink from the wind, but warmed by the thought of his surprise. I turned the knob quietly, expecting maybe the sound of carols playing or the smell of mulled cider. Instead, what greeted me made the world tilt. In the glow of the living room, where stockings hung from the mantel and a small fire burned, I saw Evan sitting back in the armchair. Sitting right on his lap was Emily, my younger sister. She leaned close, their faces pressed together in a kiss that was slow and intimate, as if I had ceased to exist. For a moment I could not move. My legs felt frozen to the threshold. The gift bag crinkled in my grip as my fingers tightened around it. The ribbon pressed against my palm until it hurt. My mind screamed at me to say something. What muchest fat hollow. Finally, words forced their way out. What is going on here? My voice was low but sharp enough to slice through the cozy silence. Avon looked up, startled at first, then annoyed, his brow furrowing. Shelby, you are overreacting. His tone was impatient, dismissive, as if I had interrupted something trivial. Emily slid off his lap, adjusting her sweater and brushing her hair back with deliberate calm. "Oh dear," she said softly. Her lips curved in a faint smile. "I think you misunderstood?" Evan was only comforting me. I let out a bitter laugh, still standing by the doorway, snow melting from my boots onto the rug. "Comforting you? That is what you call kissing someone who is about to marry your sister." Evan ran a hand over his jaw, his irritation obvious. "Shelby, look at yourself. You walk in early without notice, and now you are making this into drama." Emily has been upset. I was just trying to help. A kiss does not always mean what you think it does. I stared at him, unable to believe the absurdity of his explanation. 4 years together, an engagement ring on my finger, and this was his defense. My gaze shifted to Emily. Her eyes flickered with something smug before she quickly arranged her face into a mask of innocence. I stepped further into the room, setting the gold box down by the door with deliberate care. The cheerful wrapping suddenly looked pathetic against the hardwood floor. "Work! Let out early," I said evenly, though my chest was tight. I thought surprising my fiancé on Christmas Eve would be a good idea. Clearly, I was mistaken. Evan's expression hardened. "Shelby, do not do this. It was nothing. You always twist things." Emily tilted her head toward me, her voice dripping with concern that did not reach her eyes. "Please, do not be upset. Evan and I were only talking." I leaned closer for comfort, and you happened to walk in at the wrong moment. I felt my stomach twist. Comfort from my fiancé. I looked at her steadily, forcing my voice to remain calm. "Is that how you comfort your students at the elementary school, Emily? Or is it just reserved for men who already belong to someone else?" Her smile faltered. and for the first time her confidence cracked. She took a step back, her eyes darting toward Evan for protection. He stood quickly, placing himself between us. Enough. Shelby, you are embarrassing yourself. Embarrassing myself? The words echoed in my head. I had imagined walking into warmth and love. Instead, I was standing in a room that felt colder than the icy street outside. My sister fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, her face carefully painted into a mask of fragility. While Evan looked at me as though I were the intruder, the fire in the hearth popped loudly, a spark leaping up as if mocking the silence that followed. My hand still trembled from clutching the ribbon, but I straightened my shoulders. For years I had put my trust in this man. For years I defended my sister even when my parents favored her. And here they were, together, in front of the Christmas tree meant to be ours. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply met Evan's glare with a calm that surprised even me. The gift sat abandoned by the door, the gold ribbon catching the flicker of firelight. The night I had dreamed of was already over. Evan crossed the room toward me, his steps heavy on the wood floor, his face twisted into that familiar look he wore whenever I questioned him about anything. You are so dramatic, Shelby. Always jumping to conclusions. Always assuming the worst. Emily stood a few feet behind him, her hands folded in front of her like a child, caught in a scolding. She lowered her eyes, but not before I caught the faint curve of a smile tugging at her lips. My voice was steady even though my chest was pounding. I walked in and saw my fiancé kissing my sister. How could anyone mistake what I saw? Evan shook his head as if I were a child who needed patience. You are too jealous. Too suspicious. It was nothing more than a moment. Emily was upset. She needed comfort. In other cultures, a kiss can mean nothing at all. I almost laughed at the absurdity of his words. We were not in another culture. We were in Chicago. In the home we shared. Days away from our wedding rehearsal. The tree was decorated. Stockings hung. And he expected me to believe this was nothing more than comfort. Emily stepped forward carefully, her voice soft, her tone sweet. Shelby. Please. I would never hurt you. I leaned too close. That was my fault. Evan was only being kind. I turned to look at her. The sister I had grown up with. The girl who used to borrow my sweaters without asking. Her eyes were wide, pretending innocence, but her body still leaned ever so slightly toward Evan. You call that kindness? My words were quiet, but cut through the room. If you needed comfort, Emily, you could have called me. Instead, you sat on my fiancé's lap. She pressed her lips together, her cheeks flushing. Evan immediately stepped in. Enough. Shelby, stop making her feel guilty. She did nothing wrong. The words stung. He was protecting her, not me. I had given up my career 2 years ago because he said it would look better if his fiancée stayed home. I had cooked every meal, organized every detail of our upcoming wedding, written checks to vendors from my savings. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered. Evan placed his hand on Emily's shoulder, rubbing gently as if she were the one betrayed. She shifted closer to him and tilted her head down, playing her role as the misunderstood sister. The sight twisted something deep inside me. I drew in a breath and forced myself to stay calm. I will not argue tonight. I do not need to. I know what I saw. Evan let out a sharp laugh. What you saw was a moment taken out of context. You always do this. You twist things to make yourself the victim. Victim. The word echoed in my head. I thought of the late nights I waited for him to come home from the office at Mitchell & Sons. The dinners I reheated 3 times. The patience I told myself was love. And now he had the audacity to stand there with my sister at his side and call me dramatic. I stepped past them into the kitchen, needing space to breathe. The counter was still dusted with powdered sugar from cookies I had baked before leaving on my trip. The smell of cinnamon lingered faintly. I pressed my palms against the cold granite, grounding myself. Behind me, their voices carried low. Evan murmured something I could not make out, and Emily answered with a soft laugh. My hands curled into fists. When I turned back, Emily was watching me with her big, innocent eyes. I am sorry you walked in at the wrong moment. Shelby. I should have been more careful. Careful. The word struck me like ice water. She did not say she should not have done it, she said she should have been more careful. I walked to the front door and picked up the gold box. My fingers brushed the ribbon once more before I set it down firmly on the console table. You two may continue your evening. I will not get in the way. Evan's jaw tightened. You cannot keep doing this. Shelby. Always suspicious. Always jealous. If you keep acting like this, maybe you are not ready to be a wife. The calm in my voice surprised me again. Or maybe I am finally realizing what kind of husband you would be. Emily gasped softly, as if wounded. But I saw the glimmer of triumph in her eyes. Evan ignored me completely. His attention shifting to her. Are you all right? Did this upset you? She nodded meekly. Slipping her hand into his, he squeezed it, murmuring that she should not worry. Watching them made my stomach churn. I gathered my coat from the rack and slipped it on. Neither of them moved to stop me. The fire cracked in the hearth. The lights on the tree blinked cheerfully, and yet the room felt stripped of warmth. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and bracing. Snowflakes drifted under the glow of the street lamp. I inhaled deeply, letting the night air clear my head. My heart was heavy, but my mind was strangely sharp. This was not just a kiss. This was not just comfort. This was betrayal. Plain and undeniable. And no matter how much Evan dismissed me, or how convincingly Emily played the innocent sister, I knew the truth. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching on the thin layer of snow, and whispered to myself that this night had shattered more than just holiday plans. It had opened a crack I could never seal again. The chill followed me all the way back to my car, but it was nothing compared to the cold that had settled inside me. As I sat in the driver's seat, I let my hands rest on the steering wheel, staring at the windshield as though answers might appear there. Instead, memories began to rush back, uninvited and relentless. 3 years earlier, I had been working as a marketing manager for a mid-sized firm downtown. I liked the job. It was demanding, but it gave me independence, my own paycheck, and the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing ideas come to life. Evan used to tell me he admired how smart and ambitious I was. But once we got engaged, his tune shifted. He would say that people looked at him differently when his fiancé worked long hours, that the wives of his business associates stayed home, that it would reflect badly if I kept running from meeting to meeting. At first I resisted, but he pressed harder, saying he wanted me to focus on planning our future. In early 2021, I turned in my resignation. I told myself it was a sacrifice for love, that a few years at home would not erase everything I had built. I believed him when he promised he would provide for us, that I would never have to worry again. I remember packing up my office, placing my framed certificates and photos into a box, and convincing myself it was the right choice. Since then, my days had been filled with tasks that revolved around him. I managed the house, his meals, his laundry, every detail of our engagement party. When we set the date for the wedding, I became the project manager for our future, juggling appointments with the florist in Lincoln Park, negotiating contracts with a photographer in River North, touring venues across the city. I carried a binder filled with receipts, color swatches, and timelines. Every dollar that left my savings account felt like an investment in us. Not once did he acknowledge the hours I poured into creating the perfect day. Instead, he would glance at the invoices and mutter that I spent too much. He never mentioned that he was not the one footing the bills. My savings, built from years of hard work before I quit, dwindled as deposits went out. But I told myself it was worth it, that he would appreciate it one day, even with the wedding preparations consuming me. The shadow of family always loomed. At every holiday dinner, my parents compared me to Emily. My mother, Linda, would shake her head and say I was too serious, that men wanted a woman who smiled more. My father, Richard, would chuckle and remind me that Emily was the sweet one. the one who would have no trouble finding a husband. When Evan entered the picture, they were thrilled. At last, Shelby caught someone. They joked. They never said it outright. But I heard the undertones. Emily basked in the glow of their attention. She was the darling. The teacher with a classroom of second graders who adored her. The sister who could do no wrong. When she came home for family dinners, she always wore soft colors and carried a box of cookies from the bakery near their house in Evanston. My parents would beam, praising her thoughtfulness. While I sat there, the daughter who was apparently too sharp, too independent, too difficult. I used to tell myself it did not matter. That Evan had chosen me. He knew I was capable, organized, someone who could stand beside him as he ran Mitchell and Sons construction. That was what I thought. Anyway, tonight had stripped that illusion bare. I remembered the long nights I stayed up, adjusting seating charts. The endless phone calls with vendors who charged late fees if deposits were not in by the deadline. I thought of the florist who insisted on rare white roses, the ones Emily once called her favorite, and how I had nodded even though they cost more than I wanted to spend. It had been my money, my time, my effort, poured into something that now felt like a performance staged for my sister. I leaned back in the car seat, my eyes stinging, though no tears came. I had given up not just my career, but my sense of self. Friends from my old office had stopped inviting me to happy hours after the first year. They moved up in their careers while I perfected Evan's favorite meals. Every time I glanced at LinkedIn and saw a former coworker celebrating a promotion, I told myself my turn would come later. Now I wondered if I had simply erased myself for a man who could not even stay faithful through December. The steering wheel felt rough beneath my hands as I tightened my grip. I thought of my parents again. Of the way they would no doubt side with Emily if they knew what had happened tonight. They would say, I misunderstood. That I was too harsh. That Emily meant no harm. They would never question her the way they questioned me. A bitter taste rose in my mouth. For years I had tried to earn their approval. To be the dependable daughter, the one who made good grades, who landed the respectable job, who found a man with a steady career. Yet in their eyes, Emily's sweetness outweighed everything I accomplished. The realization settled on me with crushing weight. 4 years with Evan. 3 years without my career. Months of exhausting wedding planning. And still I stood invisible. Unappreciated. Dismissed. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, the heater blowing cold air that slowly began to warm. Outside, the snow kept falling. Soft and relentless, I thought of the binders stacked on my desk at home, full of plans that suddenly felt meaningless. I pulled away from the curb, headlights slicing through the dark street. My reflection stared back at me from the window, and in that moment I saw clearly what I had refused to admit. I had sacrificed my career, my finances, and my freedom, and none of it had been valued. That night, as the city lights blurred past, the truth lodged in my chest like a stone. I had been carrying a burden for 4 years, one that had cost me more than I ever realized, and for the first time I allowed myself to see that I had been carrying it alone. December moved forward whether I was ready or not. The calendar, filled with appointments, fittings, and tastings. Each one a reminder that the wedding was weeks away. My planner lay open on the kitchen counter, covered in notes and receipts, as if nothing had happened that Christmas Eve. On the surface, everything continued. But underneath, I carried the weight of what I had seen. Emily began showing up more often. At first she claimed she wanted to help, that she had extra time after school, let out for winter break. She offered to pick up samples from the florist, to call the bakery, to drop by the dress shop with me. She slipped into our home with an ease that unsettled me, walking straight to the kitchen, dropping her purse on the counter as though it were hers too. My mother encouraged it. Linda called one evening and said Emily had such a generous heart. She reminded me how lucky I was to have a sister willing to share the load. My father chimed in from the background, joking that maybe Emily should have been the one planning a wedding, since she seemed to enjoy it so much. Their words stung, though I pretended not to hear. Every time I looked at Emily, I remembered her on Evan's lap, her lips pressed against his. That image burned in the back of my mind. Yet in front of my parents, she acted like the perfect helper. She carried fabric swatches, circled items in catalogs, and praised Evan for being such a supportive fiancé. I started noticing the small looks they shared when they thought I was not paying attention. The way Evan's eyes lingered on her when she leaned too close to hand him a pen. The faint smirk Emily hid when I turned away. Once, during a tasting at a catering hall in Oak Brook, Emily made a joke about how Evan would probably need someone to test the wine at home later. He laughed. Not at the joke itself, but at the sparkle in her eyes. I told myself I was imagining it. That suspicion was making me paranoid. But the uneasy feeling never left. One afternoon, I came home from meeting with the florist to find Emily sitting on the living room couch, curled under a blanket. Evan was beside her, their shoulders pressed close. She jumped up when I entered, pulling the blanket off her lap and laughing nervously. Evan stood and said she had been waiting to talk about the rehearsal dinner, as if that explained her presence in my home while I was away. I smiled politely, set my bag down, and excused myself. My chest felt heavy, but I knew if I pushed it, Evan would accuse me of being jealous again. I carried that silence with me like a stone. The rehearsal dinner loomed on the calendar, a red circle marking the Friday night before the wedding. My parents were already fussing about seating arrangements, insisting Emily should sit at the head table because she was family. I bit back my protest, hearing my mother's voice telling me not to be petty. Late one evening, after a long day of errands, I walked upstairs toward our bedroom. I wanted nothing more than a hot shower and a few hours of sleep. As I passed the guest room that was meant to be converted into our future nursery, I noticed the door slightly ajar. Something caught my eye. On the edge of the bed lay a scarf I recognized instantly. Pale pink cashmere. A Christmas gift I had helped pick out for Emily 2 years ago. Next to it, a tube of lipstick rolled near the pillow, the shade she always wore. A deep rose color that left a mark on everything it touched. My breath caught. I stepped into the room and looked closer. The faint scent of her perfume lingered, floral and sharp, so out of place in what was supposed to be my home. The closet door was half open, and inside, I saw one of her tote bags tucked into the corner as if it belonged there. I stood in that room, my pulse pounding, staring at the proof of her presence. Emily had not just been visiting. She had settled herself into spaces that were never meant for her. Evan's voice called from downstairs, asking if I wanted tea. I did not answer. I picked up the scarf, feeling the softness under my fingers, and placed it back on the bed with deliberate calm. The unease that had been gnawing at me for weeks flared into certainty. This was not my imagination. This was not paranoia. Emily was weaving herself into my life, into my home, into the man I was supposed to marry, and Evan was letting her. When I finally walked out of the room, I carried nothing with me. I left the scarf and the lipstick where they were, like evidence waiting to be seen. My steps down the hallway were slow, but inside me, the suspicion had crystallized into something heavier. That night, as I lay in bed beside Evan, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I stared at the ceiling and told myself the truth I had been avoiding. What I had seen was not coincidence. It was not harmless closeness. It was betrayal, creeping in through the cracks. And I could no longer pretend I did not see it. The alarm buzzed faintly on the nightstand, but I was already awake. I had been awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling while Evan slept beside me without a trace of guilt. His even breathing filled the room like a cruel reminder of how easily he rested, while my mind twisted in knots. When dawn finally broke through the blinds, I slipped out of bed and into my coat. I told myself that a walk and a stop at the diner might clear my head, even if just for a moment. The morning air in Chicago bit hard against my cheeks. Snow clung to the sidewalk in patches, and my breath turned into fog with every exhale. The small diner on the corner smelled of butter and coffee. A varmt I kraved. I ordered a bag of fresh bagels and 2 cups of black coffee, thinking absurdly that I should bring something home. As though routine could mask the storm building inside me, the waitress smiled and wished me a Merry Christmas week. And I smiled back with a stiffness that felt unnatural. By the time I returned to the townhouse, my hands were tingling from the cold through the thin paper bag. The door was unlocked. At first, I thought Evan must have gone out to clear the snow from the steps or fetch the paper. But when I stepped inside, a sound froze me in place. Laughter. Soft. Breathless. Unmistakably intimate. It floated down from upstairs, followed by the creak of a mattress and another muffled giggle. My grip on the bag tightened, crumpling the paper. The bagels felt suddenly absurd. Heavy in my hands, I stood at the bottom of the staircase, every instinct telling me not to go up, not to confirm what I already knew in my bones. But my legs moved anyway. Each step up the staircase felt like stepping deeper into a nightmare. The hallway stretched long and quiet until I reached the door of the room that was supposed to be the bridal suite. The room we had chosen to prepare for the wedding? The door was half closed. But the trail leading up to it left little doubt. A man's shirt tossed onto the floor. A woman's cream cardigan. The one Emily had worn countless times. Thrown near the dresser. A pair of jeans tangled beside the rug. My chest tightened so sharply it was almost hard to breathe. I pushed the door open. The world tilted. There, on the bed where my wedding dress once hung in its garment bag, Ivan lay shirtless. His hair mussed. His arms tangled with Emily. She was sprawled across the sheets, lips swollen. Her rose-colored lipstick smeared faintly at the corners. Their faces were close. So close that when they turned toward me, it was like intruding on a moment, meant to be hidden but not regretted. The paper bag slipped from my hand and crashed to the floor. Coffee cups bursting open and spilling dark stains across the cream rug. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, sharp and bitter. Evan shot up instantly, panic flashing across his face as he fumbled for his shirt. Shelby. Wait. Listen. It is not what it looks like. His voice was high, almost frantic. But it only fueled the anger rising in me. Not what it looks like. The words felt like an insult. Emily did not move as quickly. She leaned back against the pillows, half covered by the sheet, her hair falling in waves across her shoulders, her eyes locked on mine with a cold, deliberate stare. Then she spoke in a voice calm and merciless. He never loved you, Shelby. Not the way he loves me. You have only ever been a placeholder because I was away. The cruelty in her words sliced through me. My hands shook, but my voice came out low and steady. Get out of my bed. Both of you. Evan hurried toward me, his shirt still unbuttoned, his hair sticking up wildly. People make mistakes. Shelby. Men make mistakes. This does not have to destroy everything we have built. Mistakes. That was his defense. As though crawling into bed with my sister, in the very room meant for our wedding, was on the same level as forgetting an anniversary. My chest rose and fell as I stared at him. I gave up my career for you. I poured my savings into this wedding. I defended you to everyone, including my own family. And this is what you do. Emily let out a laugh, sharp and triumphant. Stop acting like you did not know. He was mine before he was ever yours. The sound of her voice, the confidence dripping from every word, broke something inside me. I turned on her, my voice rising for the first time. If you think betraying your own sister makes you the winner, then you deserve every bit of what comes next. Evan reached out, his face filled with desperation. We can fix this. We can move past it. Do not make a rash decision. The calm returned to me, stronger than the fury. I shook my head, my decision forming with clarity. No. Evan. This wedding is over. Silence filled the room, heavier than any shouting could have been. Emily's smirk faltered, her eyes darting to Evan as if to measure his reaction. Evan's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. But no words came. I bent down and picked up my purse from the chair by the door. My movements were deliberate, measured, like a ritual of goodbye. I looked at them one last time, The man I had once believed was my future, and the sister I had once trusted with my secrets, and saw only strangers. As I stepped out of the room, Evan's voice followed me, pleading, then sharp, then angry. He begged me to listen, then cursed under his breath when I kept walking. Emily's voice rose too, but I no longer heard the words. They blurred into the background like meaningless noise. Down the stairs, through the hallway, past the crumpled bag of bagels and the coffee stains that would never come out of the rug, each step felt final, like the echo of a door slamming shut. The front door opened to the icy air outside, the world carrying on as if nothing inside that house had broken. The sky was pale, the snow crunching under my boots. I inhaled deeply, the cold biting my lungs, and let the truth settle into me. The wedding was not simply postponed. It was not up for reconsideration. It was cancelled. The life I had built around Evan and Emily had ended in that room, and I would never walk back inside the same way again. The rehearsal dinner was held at a restaurant in downtown Chicago, a place with warm lighting and polished wood floors, where long tables were set with wine glasses and small floral arrangements. I arrived alone, my coat buttoned tight, my hands gripping a small folder inside my purse. Around me, family and friends laughed and talked, clinking glasses as if nothing in the world could shatter this celebration. Evan stood near the head of the table, greeting guests with the charm I had once fallen for. Emily hovered close to him, her dress in soft pastel, her hair perfectly styled, a vision of innocence. My parents beamed at her, guiding relatives over to admire how helpful she had been with the preparations. I watched the scene unfold with a calm detachment, as though I were outside my own body. When everyone finally sat down, the chatter dimmed. Evan raised his glass, thanking both families for coming together. Speaking of unity and the future, his words flowed easily, lies wrapped in elegance. He spoke of me as his bride, his partner, his love. My stomach turned. I stood before he could sit again. The scrape of my chair against the floor silenced the room. Every eye turned toward me. I held my head high, my voice carrying clearly across the table. There will be no wedding. The words dropped into the room like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock through every face. My mother gasped, clutching at her pearls. My father frowned, his brow furrowing. Evan froze in place, his smile vanishing, while Emily's eyes darted around wildly before filling with staged tears. I continued before anyone could interrupt. The reason is simple. My fiancé and my sister have been betraying me. I caught them together in the very room that was supposed to be prepared for our wedding night. Gasps rose from both sides of the family. Relatives exchanged whispers, some covering their mouths in disbelief. My mother recovered first, her voice sharp with reprimand. "Shelby, how could you say something so cruel? This is jealousy talking. You are embarrassing us all." Emily let out a sob, pressing a napkin delicately to her eyes. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I was only trying to help." Her voice trembled with practiced fragility. Evan stepped forward, his hand raised as if to calm the storm. "Shelby is confused. She misread what she saw. Emily was upset, and I was comforting her. That is all." I felt the anger rise, but my voice stayed steady. Comfort does not explain lipstick smeared across pillows. It does not explain clothes scattered across the floor. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. With one swipe, I revealed the photos I had taken that morning. Evidence burned into pixels. I placed the phone on the table for all to see. Gasps and murmurs spread as the images passed from hand to hand. Then I pulled out the printed messages. The texts I had discovered on Evan's tablet days earlier. Short exchanges filled with words no sister should ever write to a man promised to her sibling. I slid the pages down the table, the silence of the room broken only by the shuffle of paper. My father's face reddened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. My mother shook her head, whispering no over and over as though denial could change reality. Evan's composure cracked. He slammed his hand on the table. "Enough." He looked around the room, desperate to salvage the image he had cultivated. People make mistakes. This is private. It does not need to be discussed here. But it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. And the whispers had already turned to judgment. Relatives averted their eyes, ashamed to look at him. Ashamed to look at Emily. Emily's tears stopped as quickly as they had started. Her face hardened, her eyes locking on me with venom. You were never enough for him. She spat, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the stunned silence. A few aunts gasped audibly, while one of Evan's uncles muttered that this was disgraceful. My mother tried to hush Emily, but the damage was done. I stood tall, gathering my phone and papers back into my purse. Let this be clear, I said firmly. This wedding is cancelled. The relationship is finished. And everyone here deserves to know why. The room was heavy with silence, thick with judgment and disbelief. Evan tried to speak again, his face pale with fury. But no one listened. Emily looked around the table, searching for support, but found only eyes turned away. I lifted my glass of water, not to toast, but to steady my hand. With finality, I said, I will not marry a man who betrays me. Nor will I stand by while my sister takes what was never hers. I placed the glass back on the table and walked out of the room. Behind me, the voices rose again. The sound of family torn apart, echoing against the restaurant's polished walls. Evan's name, Emily's name, my own, all tangled in whispers of shock and disgrace. As I stepped into the cold night air, the city lights flickering across the river, I drew in a long breath. For the first time in years, I felt something close to freedom. The rehearsal dinner had ended not with promises of unity, but with the truth laid bare. Evan and Emily's reputations lay shattered, and I no longer carried the weight of protecting them. The next morning, I woke with a strange clarity, as if the chaos of the rehearsal dinner had burned away the haze I had been living under. My phone sat on the nightstand, buzzing with unanswered calls and messages from relatives, from my parents, even from Evan. I ignored them all. Instead, I opened the folder I had kept for months, the one with receipts, contracts, and payment confirmations. Every deposit had come from my account. Every vendor had spoken with me directly. If the wedding was over, I would not leave behind the thousands of dollars I had poured into it. I started with the venue. The ballroom on Michigan Avenue had been my dream choice. With its crystal chandeliers and riverfront view, the contract lay in my binder, my signature on the dotted line, my bank account listed for the payments. I called the manager. Mon voice firm. The wedding is cancelled. I am requesting the deposit refunded immediately. The woman hesitated, likely remembering all the meetings where Evan barely showed up and I had handled every detail. She confirmed my request and promised a check would be mailed within 2 weeks. Relief washed over me. But I did not stop there. Next was the caterer. I had chosen a company in Lincoln Park, known for their delicate hors d'oeuvres and perfectly plated entrees. Again, the receipts carried only my name. I explained the situation clearly, outlining the cancellation policy I had memorized months earlier. They resisted at first, trying to keep a portion as a penalty, but I countered with the clause in our agreement. Within minutes, they agreed to refund the full amount. The florist was easier. She remembered how I had stood in her shop in November, debating over roses versus lilies, while Evan rushed off to a meeting. She sighed when I called, her voice gentle, and told me she would refund my deposit in full. She even added that she was sorry, though she did not need to be. The photographer was last, a young woman from Wicker Park who had been thrilled to shoot our winter wedding. I emailed her directly, attaching the signed cancellation form. She replied almost immediately, promising the money would be back in my account within days. By the time I set down my phone, I had secured nearly $48,000 in refunds. My savings account, once depleted by this wedding, would be restored. The thought made my chest rise with something I had not felt in a long time. Control. Later that afternoon, Evan showed up at my apartment. He looked haggard, his tie loose, his hair unkempt. He barged in without waiting for me to invite him, his voice already raised. "What have you done?" "Shelby. The venue called me, the caterer too. They said the wedding is cancelled, and you demanded the deposits back. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I met his anger with calm. "Those deposits were from my savings. Not yours. My name is on every contract. If you are humiliated, it is only because people finally see who you are." His jaw tightened, his face pale with disbelief. "You are lying." "I paid for half at least." I reached for the folder on my desk, pulled out the receipts, and dropped them in front of him. Every line showed my name, my account number, my signature. He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking, his voice faltering. "You really think this proves anything? You are just trying to make me look small." I stood tall, no tremor in my voice. "I do not need to try. You managed that on your own." For the first time, I watched his arrogance falter, the realization that he had not just lost me, but also the financial ground he believed he owned. He looked around the apartment, as though searching for some thread of control to grab onto, but found none. Emily called him then. I heard her voice through the speaker, high and frantic, demanding to know what was happening. Evan silenced the phone, his face reddening. He looked at me one last time, his voice filled with rage. "You will regret this." But when he stormed out, slamming the door behind him, I did not feel fear. I felt lighter. I walked to the window. The city below buzzing with traffic and holiday lights still strung across the streets. My reflection looked back at me in the glass. No longer the woman who had bent over backwards to hold everything together. I was the woman who had cancelled the wedding, taken back her money, and walked away with her independence intact. The wedding was gone. The future I thought I wanted burned away. But in its place stood something stronger. Proof that I was not powerless. That every sacrifice I had made was not lost. That I could reclaim what was mine. That evening, as I logged into my bank account and saw the pending refunds, I allowed myself a small smile. Evan had thought he stripped me of everything. That without him, I was nothing. Instead, I had walked away, not only free, but with every dollar of my own. For the first time in years, I felt untethered. My future mine alone to shape. The days after the rehearsal dinner passed in a blur. My phone never stopped buzzing. But I silenced it and tucked it away in a drawer. Calls from my mother. Messages from my father. Endless texts from Evan demanding explanations or spewing insult. For once, I did not feel the need to respond. I went about my mornings quietly, making coffee, walking through the city streets, letting the cold wind against my face remind me I was free. One evening, I decided to stop at a cafe in the Loop, the kind of place I had avoided while with Evan because he said it was too crowded, too noisy. I sat by the window with a mug warming my hands, staring out at people hurrying along the sidewalks. It felt good to be invisible for a moment, to be just another woman in the city, instead of the subject of scandal. That was when I heard my name. I turned, startled, and there he was, Austin Reynolds. He had aged into his confidence, his dark hair, neatly combed but dusted with snow, his tailored suit, his steady eyes. We had dated briefly years ago, before Evan. Before my life narrowed to fit someone else's mold. Back then, I had admired his ambition, his calmness, but I let him go when Evan swept in with promises that felt bigger and brighter. Now, sitting in that cafe, I could not help but think of how different things might have been. "Shelby," he said with that warm half-smile I remembered. "I almost did not believe it was you." I nodded, surprised at how easily my lips curved into a smile. "It has been a while." "Austin." He asked if he could sit. I gestured to the empty chair, and soon we were drinking coffee together as though no years had passed. I do not know what came over me, but I began talking. Words poured out of me, heavier than I expected. I told him about the betrayal, about Emily, About the cancelled wedding. I described how my parents had called me selfish, how Evan had accused me of being jealous, how everyone seemed to expect me to stay silent and endure. I waited for his judgment, for pity, for the look people gave when they thought I was ruined. But Austin only listened. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and said softly, "I am sorry you went through that, but you did the right thing. Walking away was the strongest choice you could have made." The words nearly undid me. No one had said that. Not my parents. Not my friends. Not even myself. To hear it from him was like being handed oxygen after drowning. I mentioned Evan's threats, the messages filled with rage, the voicemails telling me I would regret leaving. Austin's face hardened, the lawyer in him flashing through. "Document everything," he said firmly. "Save every text, every voicemail. If he crosses a line, we can take him to court." That word wrapped around me like armor. For months I had felt isolated, and now someone was standing beside me. Austin leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you have copies of the contracts for the wedding?" I nodded. Then he said, "Good. We will file to annul the engagement formally. That way, he cannot claim you owe him anything. And if he tries to harass you, we will have the legal grounds ready." We moved to his office later that week. The space was sleek, lined with shelves of legal texts and framed certificates. I sat across from his desk, sliding folders of receipts and printed messages toward him. He studied each page carefully, asking precise questions, making notes. For the first time, I felt like my voice mattered. With Evan, I had always been too emotional, too dramatic. With Austin, I was a partner in my own defense. He explained each step in clear detail. We would file the annulment papers at the county office, attach evidence that the engagement ended due to misconduct, and secure a notice preventing Evan from making claims against me. I listened closely, feeling the knot in my chest loosen with every explanation. During a pause, I found myself watching him, the way he leaned back slightly when he was thinking, the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated. He caught me staring and tilted his head with a small smile. "What is it?" "Shelby." I shook my head, embarrassed. "It is just, you are the first person in a long time who makes me feel like I am not crazy." His expressions softened. "You were never crazy. You were betrayed." Do not let him rewrite that truth. The certainty in his tone anchored me. For years, Avon had made me doubt myself. Every suspicion had been labeled jealousy. Every concern brushed aside. Sitting in Austin's office, hearing his steady voice, I realized how much I had lost under the weight of gaslighting. After finishing the paperwork, he offered to walk me home. The streets were bright with holiday lights, garlands strung across lampposts, windows glowing with decorated trees. People passed us carrying shopping bags, their laughter spilling into the cold air. For the first time, I felt like I belonged among them, like my life was not broken, but simply shifting. At the corner, Austin slowed his steps. "Shelby, this is not just about ending a wedding. It is about reclaiming who you are. You have already started." I nodded, feeling the truth of it. I had thought I had lost everything, but here I was, holding on to my dignity, my savings, and now the tools to protect myself. When I finally lay in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling the way I had on so many sleepless nights before. But the silence was different. The weight pressing down on me was no longer despair, but determination. Austin's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that betrayal did not define me. My choices did. For the first time since the collapse of my engagement, I closed my eyes not with dread, but with a quiet, cautious hope. The following weekend, I received a message in our old classmates group chat. Someone had organized a reunion at a bar in Lincoln Park, called the Night Owl Lounge. At first I hesitated. Reunions had never been my thing. And after the public mess of my cancelled wedding, I was not sure I wanted to walk into a room full of familiar faces. But then I heard through a friend that Evan and Emily had RSVP'd, The thought of them spinning the story to make me the villain stirred something sharp inside me. I decided I would go. Not to beg for sympathy, but to speak the truth. The Night Owl Lounge was dimly lit, with a neon sign glowing red over the entrance. Inside, the second floor had been reserved for the reunion. Music thumped softly from speakers, and groups of old classmates clustered at tables. Catching up over drinks, I arrived in a simple black dress. Nothing extravagant, but enough to remind myself that I could walk into a room with my head high. It did not take long to spot them. Evan stood near the bar, laughing too loudly, his arm around Emily's waist. She wore a fitted dress, her hand deliberately flashing a ring that caught the light. My stomach turned, recognizing it as the one Evan once claimed he had saved for me. They looked smug, as though the whole evening was theirs to command. I made my way to a table with a few familiar faces from high school. They greeted me warmly, but I could sense the curiosity in their eyes. Whispers about my cancelled wedding had already traveled through the group chat like wildfire. Not long after, Evan raised his glass and began speaking to a cluster of classmates. His voice carried across the room. Shelby could not handle the pressure. She was always jealous, always suspicious. You all know how it is when a woman cannot trust. Laughter rippled through the group. Though uneasy, Emily leaned closer, her voice pitched high enough for others to hear. She walked out because she could not stand that Evan still cared about me. Poor thing. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I did not move until Evan added the line that tipped everything. I gave her everything. I even gave her a few thousand a month just to keep her comfortable. She never had to work a day. The smug nods from a few classmates made my hands tremble under the table. That was not just betrayal. That was rewriting my sacrifice, as though I had been some dependent, living off his generosity. I stood then, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound loud enough to hush the room. I walked toward the bar where Evan and Emily stood, every eye following me. My voice was calm, but it carried. A few thousand a month. Is that what you told them? Evan's smirk wavered, but he kept his chin high. It is true. I supported you. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened the banking app, scrolling to the recurring transfers. I held the screen up for those closest to see. $2,000 a month. That is all. And for the record, every deposit on the venue, the catering, the florist, and the photographer came from me. Over $48,000. Every receipt has my name on it, not his. Gasps rose from the crowd. People leaned closer, murmuring, their eyes darting between me and Evan. One man muttered that $2,000 a month barely covered rent in the city. Another woman whispered that I had paid nearly the entire wedding alone. Emily's face pallid, her attempt at a smile collapsing. Evan flushed red, his jaw tightening as he tried to recover. That is not the point, he snapped. You are just trying to embarrass me. I took a step closer, my heels clicking against the floor. You embarrassed yourself when you chose my sister over me in the bed that was meant for our wedding night. The room went silent. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Evan's composure shattered as whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Emily tried to interject, her voice trembling. You are twisting things. Evan never loved you the way he loved me. But no one seemed convinced. One classmate laughed bitterly and asked if Emily really thought stealing her sister's fiancé was something to brag about. Others shook their heads, muttering about betrayal and shame. I turned away from them both, not needing to say more. My point had been made. Evan's image of the generous provider crumbled in front of everyone, replaced by the reality of a man who contributed little and took much. Emily's attempt to paint me as jealous dissolved under the weight of facts and receipts. The noise in the room grew, classmates murmuring and gossiping. But I no longer cared. I had come to show the truth. And I had. Evan's face was tight with humiliation, Emily's eyes glassy as she tried to hold on to her composure. I walked back to my table, calm now, my hands no longer trembling. The chatter swirled around me, but I let it fade into the background. For once, I did not feel like the one being judged. Tonight, it was them standing in the spotlight of disgrace. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages from classmates who had been at the Night Owl Lounge. Screenshots of group chats poured in. Evan's name plastered across conversations filled with disbelief and ridicule. People repeated the details I had laid out, mocking the way he boasted about paying for my life only for everyone to learn I had carried the financial weight of the wedding. One message read that Evan looked like a fool standing red-faced while Emily stammered at his side. Another joked that Emily had won a man who could not even cover a wedding bill. By noon, the whispers had traveled beyond our class circle. On LinkedIn, I saw subtle comments about Mitchell and Sons, the family-owned construction company Evan ran as CEO. Business contacts whispered that if he misrepresented something as personal as his finances, what else might he be hiding? His polished image of the successful, responsible heir began to crack. Later that week, Austin called me into his office. His expression was serious, but not for me. He closed the door and gestured for me to sit. "I wanted to tell you before you heard it elsewhere," he said quietly. "The IRS opened an audit into Mitchell and Sons. They are looking into filings from 2022 through 2024. My breath caught. Evan's arrogance had always been sharp, but I had never imagined it might extend into something criminal. Austin continued. The company claimed deductions that do not line up. There are inconsistencies in payroll records and contracts. If they dig deeper, it could turn into a fraud case. For a moment, I felt a flash of panic. My name had been tied to Evan for years. Would they drag me into it? Austin seemed to sense my fear. He leaned forward, his voice steady. I have already reviewed your accounts, Shelby. You have no financial ties to Mitchell and Sons. No co-signed loans. No shared investments. Everything you contributed was separate. You are clear. The relief was so strong I had to close my eyes for a moment. Thank you, Austin, I whispered. He gave a small smile. This is his storm, not yours. Over the next few weeks, the news grew worse for Evan. A leaked memo revealed that an accountant inside Mitchell and Sons had flagged issues months earlier. But Evan ignored the warnings. Old contracts resurfaced, showing inflated expenses and missing invoices. The story hit local business journals, then spread to state media. Evan Mitchell, the golden son of a respected family business, was now under scrutiny for tax fraud. I did not seek the details, but they found me anyway. Classmates forwarded articles. Relatives gossiped in texts I refused to answer. The humiliation Evan once tried to pin on me now clung to him with no escape. One evening, I walked along the Chicago River with Austin, the winter lights reflecting off the water. The wind was sharp, but his presence beside me was grounding. He glanced at me as we walked. How do you feel watching this unfold? I thought about it carefully. Once, I might have felt pity. Once, I would have rushed to defend him, to believe his excuses. But not now. Now, all I felt was a quiet inevitability. Karma had finally come to collect. Austin nodded as if he understood. You reclaimed your independence just in time. If you were still tied to him, you might have been dragged into this mess. The thought made me shiver. Not from the cold, but from the realization of how close I had come to ruin. My life had felt shattered weeks earlier. But in truth, I had stepped away just before the ground collapsed. Within a month, reports surfaced that the IRS had compiled enough evidence to consider criminal charges. Mitchell and Sons faced fines in the millions. Shareholders demanded Evan step aside while the investigation unfolded. His once polished LinkedIn profile went quiet. His public appearances disappeared. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Emily still clung to him, showing up at the office and insisting to anyone who would listen that he was innocent. But her voice carried little weight now. People no longer admired her as the pretty younger sister. They whispered instead about betrayal, about arrogance, about greed. At night, as I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea, I thought about how everything had shifted. Evan once believed he was untouchable. that his charm and his family's name would shield him forever. But, standing at the edge of losing everything, he was just another man facing the consequences of his own choices. The irony did not escape me. He had accused me of being dependent, of needing him to survive, yet here I was, free, steady, and rebuilding. While he watched his empire crumble under the weight of lies, I set my mug down and looked out the window at the city lights. The future still felt uncertain, but for the first time, I was not afraid. Evan's downfall was not my triumph, but it was proof that truth had a way of rising, and I no longer had to carry the burden of protecting him from it. News of the IRS audit spread faster than anyone expected, and with it came cracks in the facade that Emily had worked so hard to maintain. I heard through mutual relatives that she had begun clinging to Evan in desperation, showing up at his office uninvited, demanding that he marry her immediately. She thought a rushed wedding might shift the narrative, that becoming his wife would protect her from humiliation. But Evan had grown colder, hardened by the weight of his own troubles. When she begged him, he brushed her off with a sneer, telling her he had no intention of tying himself down while fighting for his company. Emily's pleas turned into shouting matches, overheard by employees who gossiped about her breakdowns in the lobby. The same woman who once smirked from Evan's side now chased after him like an afterthought. He refused to answer her calls, and when he did, his words were sharp and dismissive. She had been useful to him as a distraction, but in the face of ruin, she was nothing more than dead weight. At the same time, my parents felt the sting of disgrace. At family gatherings, whispers followed them. Relatives who had once admired their picture-perfect younger daughter now spoke of betrayal and shame. My father, unable to bear the ridicule, began lashing out at Emily. He accused her of destroying the family's name, of humiliating them in front of everyone. My mother, who had always doted on her, turned silent, her disappointment hanging heavier than words. For the first time in her life, Emily no longer had the safety net of parental approval. I stayed away from their chaos. Instead, I found solace in the cemetery where my mother was buried. One Sunday afternoon, I drove out to Oakwood Cemetery with a bouquet of white lilies. The winter air was crisp, the ground still frozen in patches. I knelt by her headstone, brushing away the thin layer of frost. "Mom," I whispered. "I did it." I walked away from him. I thought for years that I had to hold on, that leaving would mean failure. But you were right. You always wanted me to choose happiness, not appearances. The silence of the cemetery was comforting. I let the words flow, telling her about the cancelled wedding, about Evan's downfall, about the strength I was finding again. I placed my hand on the stone and closed my eyes. I am living the way you hoped I would. And for the first time, I feel like I am not letting you down. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel broke my reverie. I turned and saw Emily standing a few feet away, her coat hanging loose, her face blotched from crying. She looked nothing like the composed sister who once smirked at my pain. "Why, Shelby," she cried out, her voice breaking. "Why did you have to ruin everything? If you had just stayed quiet, if you had just married him, none of this would have happened." I rose slowly, brushing the dirt from my hands. My voice was calm. "I did not ruin anything. Emily, you did this yourself. You made your choices, and now you are living with them." Her eyes blazed with fury and despair. "You think you are better than me. You always did. But Evan loved me. He always loved me more." I shook my head gently. "If he loved you, he would have married you when you begged him. If he loved you, he would not be ignoring your calls now." Her lips trembled, and tears streamed down her face. She stumbled closer, her voice rising in desperation. "They all blame me now. Mom, Dad, the family. They say I destroyed everything. Do you know what that feels like?" "Yes," I said quietly, holding her gaze. "I know exactly what it feels like to be blamed for things that were never mine to carry. But unlike you, I did not destroy myself to win someone who never valued me." She let out a sob so raw it echoed through the quiet cemetery. For a moment, I almost felt pity, but then I remembered her smug smile. Her deliberate betrayal. The way she relished my pain. Whatever sympathy I might have had dissolved into clarity. Emily collapsed onto the cold ground, clutching at her coat as if it could hold her together. I watched her, my heart steady. You are alone because you chose to betray the people who loved you. You cannot pin that on me. She lifted her face toward me, her voice hoarse. Please, Shelby, please help me. I shook my head slowly. No, Emily, I will not save you from the consequences of your own actions. I turned back to my mother's grave, laying the lilies down gently. Behind me, Emily's sobs filled the air, broken and desperate. For the first time, she faced what it meant to be abandoned. Not by me, but by everyone she had thought would shield her. As I walked back to my car, I felt the weight of the past lifting. My sister had chosen her path, and now she would walk it alone. I had no obligation to carry her anymore. My life, at last, was mine to protect. The new year arrived with a kind of clarity I had never felt before. While the city bustled with its usual resolutions and fresh starts, the Mitchell family name was unraveling in the news. Every week, another article appeared, detailing how Evan's company, Mitchell Sons, had been audited by the IRS. At first, it was speculation, whispers of irregularities and clerical errors. But by February, the evidence was too heavy to deny. The court filings showed deliberate tax evasion, millions hidden through falsified payrolls and inflated contracts between 2022 and 2024. I read the stories like an outsider. Once upon a time, I would have defended him blindly, insisting there had to be another explanation. But now, I felt only the strange satisfaction of seeing truth finally expose what I had sensed all along. Karma had simply done its work. Evan was forced to step down as CEO. The board, made up of relatives and investors who had once praised his leadership, unanimously voted him out. His office nameplate was removed, his privileges revoked. Photos surfaced of him walking out of the courthouse, shoulders hunched, his expensive suit wrinkled, his eyes empty. He had once been the golden heir of a family empire. Now he was nothing more than a disgraced executive waiting for sentencing. Emily's spiral was even harsher. She had bet everything on the illusion that marrying Evan would elevate her. Instead, she was left clinging to a man who no longer had power or wealth to offer. She begged him to marry her in private, desperate to salvage some shred of honor. But he brushed her off coldly. I heard from one of our cousins that he told her flatly, "I don't need more deadweight." With Evan gone, Emily lost her shine in the eyes of the world she had worked so hard to impress. She had no career to lean on, no achievements of her own, and soon even her closest friends stopped answering her calls. Our parents, once her fiercest defenders, turned bitter. My father scolded her for ruining the family name. My mother stopped speaking to her altogether. Emily found herself isolated, moving from one borrowed couch to another, living in the shadow of humiliation she had built with her own hands. I did not revel in her downfall, but I did not carry guilt for it either. She had chosen betrayal, and betrayal always extracts its price. My life, in contrast, was slowly rebuilding. Austin was by my side through it all, steady and reassuring. He reviewed every legal document tied to Evan's case and confirmed that my finances were untouched, that I was free from any liability. He guided me through filing a formal annulment of my engagement, ensuring that no one could twist the narrative to claim I had abandoned obligations. Sitting across from him in his office, watching his calm confidence as he spoke, I felt something inside me begin to trust again. By March, Austin and I made a decision together. We walked into the Cook County Clerk's office one bright afternoon, hand in hand, and applied for our marriage license. The process was simple, but the meaning was immense. I signed my name next to his, a clean break from the past, a new beginning with someone who respected me. We did not throw a lavish ceremony. Instead, We celebrated with a quiet dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the lake. The walls were lined with photographs of Naples, the air filled with the scent of garlic and fresh bread. Austin raised his glass and said softly, "To us." For the first time in years, I believed in those words. Spring unfolded, and with it came new plans. Austin was offered a position with a firm in Seattle, and when he asked if I would come with him, I did not hesitate. Chicago had been both my battlefield and my cage. It was time to leave it behind. On our last evening in the city, we stood in the apartment, surrounded by packed boxes. The skyline stretched outside the window, familiar and distant all at once. I thought of the girl I had been when I moved in, eager to please, desperate for love, willing to sacrifice my own voice. And I thought of the woman I was now, holding Austin's hand, ready to write a story that belonged to me. We drove out at dawn, the car heavy with boxes and light with hope. The highway stretched wide and endless. Austin reached across the console and took my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. His grip was warm, steady, unshakable. I turned to him, smiling, and felt peace wash over me. Behind us, Evan faced sentencing. Reports said he would serve time and pay millions in penalties. Mitchell and Sons struggled to rebuild under new leadership, its name forever tainted by his arrogance. Emily faded from public view, her once carefully curated image shattered. Friends who had once praised her turned their backs. Even our parents, stripped of pride, left her to navigate the wreckage alone. I did not chase updates. I did not need to. Their paths no longer touched mine. Ahead of me stretched a life of my own making, a marriage built on trust, not lies, a partnership where my voice mattered, a future free from the weight of betrayal. As we crossed the state line, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the road ahead. I felt my chest open with a quiet certainty. The past was behind me, and it would stay there. If you found yourself betrayed not only by the one you loved, but also by your own family, what would you do? Would you forgive? Or would you walk away to protect your happiness and build a new life? Share your thoughts with me. And do not forget to stay connected for more stories like this one.